Okay, so I've been working on this case fatality rate report for Australia for several weeks now, and I've shared quite a few videos. Some of them are quite long, so I apologise about that. But today is the 4th of August, and the data is getting to a point where I believe I can make a call that the case fatality rate for the Sydney wave is significantly different to the Melbourne fatality rate. I started this journey maybe 3 weeks ago believing that was clear, but once I built the report, I realized that it wasn't clear, and I'll show you what I mean. And I'm going to update you now on exactly my findings using the data that's available to me, also using Power BI. So just a short video. Now, I'm going to keep this report continuously up to date. You can find the report here at xbi.com.au/CA, standing for COVID Australia. All right, so I'm going to jump straight over to the case fatality rate page. And so the case fatality rate is a very simple division. Divide the total deaths by the total cases, and that gives you the case fatality rate. But there are some nuances here. So this is the Australian data, and this light blue line is the cases. It's actually daily cases. So as a new case comes in, we get counted. So it's not active cases, it's just the total daily cases. And once I built this report, it became immediately obvious to me, particularly if you look at this Melbourne wave here, this second wave or the second phase, you'll notice that the cases go up first, and then followed thereafter, the deaths start to appear. And that's because presumably people get sick, and then they get sicker, and then some people unfortunately die. And so through the sharing that I did on my blog, I developed this slider. And what this slider allows me to do is allows me to do a time shift. It allows me to basically realign the cases with the deaths so that I can at least visually try and align the patterns in the charts. And what I've discovered is that 19 days is the correct lag to apply for the Australian scenario. And so once I apply a 19-day death lag, I basically get these curves following each other. Now, the implication of that is over here. So this is the current active phase now within Sydney, is that because I've done a 19-day shift, basically in that direction, it means that I need to wait another 19 days before we see what impact this section of the cases has on deaths. There's always going to be a 19-day lag. And so therefore, it's not really practical to do a direct comparison between this case fatality rate, which was the case fatality rate in Melbourne last year, that's this one here, and this one, because this 0.3% here is taking into account the 5,000 cases and the 15 deaths, but we know that there's this 19-day lag. And so hence I've developed this concept of lag adjust. So this green line here tells me that I'm only looking at the data up until the green line. And in fact, I've done the same thing. If I just clear this chart, I've done the same thing for every single phase. So when I'm doing a comparison between phase 2, which is the Melbourne wave, and phase 4, which is the Sydney wave, I'm only looking at the data up until the green line, which happens to be 45 days in, so 46 days actually. So if I jump now over to my phase comparison, I've produced this small multiples analysis, and you can see at the moment I don't have the phase adjust in place, but if I now move this into the 19 days adjusted, you can see that I'm ignoring any cases that are appearing on the right hand side of this green line, and therefore I'm also ignoring all the data on the right hand side of the green line here for the Melbourne phase. So I'm only doing a comparison between this data here in Melbourne and the equivalent data here in Sydney. And the starting point happens to be the point in which the 10th case was identified, right? So I basically ignored the data until there were 10 cases. Once that 10 cases occurred, then I started the phase analysis basically. And it's clear, two things are clear. Firstly, the number of cases is significantly less in Sydney. Now, that could be because of many things. Maybe it's better lockdown procedures. In fact, very early on, Sydney's lockdowns were not as severe as the Melbourne lockdowns, although I think if you go back into 2020, perhaps the cases got away a little bit from Melbourne before they realised what was going on. But if you look at the gap between the light blue line and the dark blue columns, you'll see that at least visually there's a big difference. And so this is when we look at it as small multiples. And in fact, if I come and have a look at this alternate way, what I've done is I've taken that same data and I've separated, first of all, the cases. So here are all the cases. And so the blue line is the Melbourne, green is the Sydney wave. So you can see demonstrably that the total number of cases is significantly different. The same applies for the total deaths, significantly different. And when I look at the comparison between the relative numbers for the cases and the relative numbers for the deaths, that's when we come up with the case fatality rate. And so remember, just looking at the data up until the 46th day, because I'm doing this death lag adjustment, at the same point, 46 days in, Melbourne wave had a 3.5% case fatality rate and Sydney's got a 1% case fatality rate. And so that's 3.6 times less fatal. The current phase in Sydney is 3.6 times less fatal than the phase that occurred in Melbourne middle of last year. And that's important. Now, I don't know why it's less fatal. There are a number of reasons that it could be. It could be because there are higher vaccination rates. Of course, there were no vaccinations last year. It could be because we're doing a better job at protecting the vulnerable. It could be because the Delta variant is less virulent. Even though it is more contagious, it is less virulent. And the reality is it's probably all of those things and possibly more things. But the important thing to know is that the Sydney wave is 3.6 times less fatal at the equivalent point than the Melbourne phase, and over time we will learn more and more about whether this trend continues and whether the gap gets further apart or not. So just a reminder, if you would like to have a look at this report, it's available at xbi.com.au/CA, CA standing for COVID Australia.